So I'll talk about the methodology around our research a little later on, but we were overwhelmed by responses to this survey. We expected something like 1,000 women to answer our survey. In the event, nearer 4,000 answered. We're really, really grateful to the many partners that worked with us to distribute the survey amongst employees in their organisation, but also to the people who came to us directly via our own network. 4,000 women was a really superb response and means that we've got some really valuable and resilient insight into this critical question of why women leave. There's a lot more detail about methodology in the report itself, so I won't go into that into any more detail here. But I wanted to start with some good news, because against the backdrop of a sort of flurry of media reports around this question of the retention of women, which are overwhelmingly and unsurprisingly very negative in nature, actually we find a lot of really positive data about women in the workplace. So for example, 2/3, slightly more than 2/3, 67% speak positively about the culture of their organisation, and as we'll see through the course of this presentation, that is a really critical factor in retention. Slightly more, 68%, speak positively about their experience of the day-to-day work, what it's like to just do the job that they're paid to do. Nearly 3/4 speak positively about the support that they get from their line manager, another critical factor. And fully 3/4 speak positively about their ability to work flexibly from the perspective of location. And obviously quite significant strides have been made in this respect since the pandemic, even if they haven't necessarily been made to the same extent in respect of other forms of flexibility. But this really matters, being able to work flexibly from a location perspective. We know not only from this research, but also from previous research, that this can have a really significant bearing on the retention of women in the workplace. And perhaps most hearteningly, 82% speak positively about the team that they work with. And I have to say, I find this one of the most heartening pieces of data in our whole research, because even where women are struggling in respect of a range of other factors, perhaps most notably of which that kind of broader corporate culture, you often still find really positive views about the immediate team around people. In fact, our strong sense is that one sometimes happens as a reaction to the other. In other words, positive views about team are a direct reaction to what people perceive as being failures in wider corporate culture. There's a real sense that teams, whether they're bound to or not, kind of create their own set of values, their own moral compass, their own set of team ethics, and their own sort of mechanisms for making work an enjoyable and productive and meaningful place to be. So really heartening data here that, as I say, does sometimes serve to highlight things that aren't going so well elsewhere. Nevertheless, the average respondent to our survey said that they were 38% likely to leave their employer in the next 2 years. Now, we ask about the next 2 years rather than the next year, because we want to capture the intention to leave as well as sort of committed action. We were concerned that what we might find otherwise was women who were at work and pretty much committed to leaving, but without a firm plan to do so yet, and therefore that this number would be lower than it really should be. Interestingly enough, despite the fact that we've opened this up to 2 years, actually the data we find is quite similar to other studies that we've seen that look only at 1 year. So 38% likely to leave. Now, that number in a sense isn't the most important thing here, and certainly until we have longitudinal data to compare this with, it's a little bit hard to say whether that's high or low, kind of what's happening with that number. You will, of course, all have your own reaction to that. I think personally I was quite surprised at how low that was. And in fact, there's some data to suggest that may actually be a little low compared with the reality. Why do I say that? Well, we had 2 different groups of women who answered our survey. One who came through those partner organisations who received the link to the survey via their employer, and another who came direct to the survey via our network, via social media, whatever it was. And what seems to be the case is that people who came via their employer, despite assurances of anonymity, in other words, we're not going to send any of this information in any kind of attributable form back to your employer, were significantly more positive, significantly less likely to say that they were thinking of leaving than those that sort of came to us directly. In fact, those who came to us directly said that they were 52% likely to leave. So really quite a significant difference. So we need to be a bit cautious about this number. But as I say, in itself, it isn't kind of the most important thing at this stage. What it is a very useful variable against which to control a range of other factors. We can really see what moves this number and what doesn't. So let's start with the question of who's leaving, because the answer to that turns out to be possibly one of the most instructive, certainly one of the most interesting in all of our research. Start, for example, with the question of age. How does age affect a woman's propensity to leave? Well, the simple answer to this is barely at all. That's perhaps slightly over-exaggerating it. We see a slight uplift amongst women in their mid-40s. The number rises from 38% to 40%. We see a slight dip amongst women in their mid to late 50s, where the number dips down to about 35%. But those are the extremes of the range. The number never goes above 40%, it never goes below 35%. So age doesn't appear to have a really significant bearing on a woman's propensity to leave. What about motherhood? Same story. Women without children are 40% likely to leave. Women with children, 37% likely to leave. Really not significant differences. If anything, actually, women with children are slightly, as you can see, slightly less likely to leave. Having children makes women slightly more kind of sticky in the workplace. We're not here factoring in the number of hours worked. So, of course, many of those women with children might be working part-time. We're thinking more simply about just sort of general employment status. But we're not seeing the kind of effect that we might expect to see. Now, it's really important to point out, to acknowledge that there's almost certainly a degree of survivor bias in this data. In other words, we're speaking to the women who remain, not to the ones who left. We have, in the course of our survey, heard from some people who have left their employer, and I'm going to talk a little bit about those later on. But overwhelmingly, the data here is from people who remain in work. Nevertheless, these numbers just aren't as different as we might expect them to be. Motherhood doesn't appear to have quite the bearing on propensity to leave that we might expect it to have. What about menopause? Something that's quite rightly and understandably in the media at the moment and being talked about a lot right now. Well, in fact, we find no difference here between women with menopause symptoms, and we include perimenopause in that, and women with menopause, both 38% likely to leave. That's not to say that menopause isn't something that women struggle with in the workplace, that menopause can't make work a very difficult place to be. But it's not adding up to an increased propensity to leave. In fact, amongst women that remain, we don't see any difference here at all. So it's all adding up to the idea that the question of who's leaving isn't quite the right question. There's one exception to that, which is ethnicity. Ethnicity is the one personal characteristic, if you like, that does appear to affect these numbers. So white women, who made up the majority of our sample, about 86%, so broadly in line with the UK population, broadly, slightly less than average to say that they're going to leave, 37%. Asian women, slightly above average, 40%. People from mixed, multiple ethnic groups, slightly more likely again, 45%. And black women, really quite significantly more likely to leave, 49%. And what's interesting is that however we kind of combine this data to look for kind of intersectional insights, the number, that 38% number, doesn't really seem to move an awful lot. So for example, we can combine women with menopause symptoms who have children and are in their mid-50s, for example, or in their mid-40s, and it doesn't really do much to alter that number until we layer in ethnicity. Once you start adding non-white ethnic groups to the mix, then you start to see the numbers shifting quite significantly. I say quite significantly, but actually compared with some of the other factors that we look at, and I'll talk about later in our research, these differences aren't huge. And it really adds up to what I think is the most important, most significant message that emerges through our research. Because what these 4,000 women seem to be saying more than anything else is that when it comes to the question of retention, they're not the problem. It's not me, they're saying. It's you. I'm not the problem. The problem is the organisation. And actually, in thinking about this, and looking at other similar stories around this, I came across some really interesting, a really interesting story about burnout within the healthcare sector, and a situation in which employees on the front line within a healthcare organisation who were on their knees burning out were encouraged by their management to prioritise self-help and self-care, and were absolutely devastated at that conclusion being reached by their employers, because it seemed to them to miss the much more important point, which was they weren't the problem. It wasn't that there was something wrong with these people that was causing them to burn out. The problem was systemic and cultural, and it made the employees of this organisation deeply unhappy to realise that their organisation simply was not grasping that message, that it still thought that they were the problem. And the wonderful article in The Beautiful Truth magazine, a magazine, by the way, that I highly recommend, which kind of talks all about this story and refers to the decades of research that exist around burnout specifically, but with exactly the same message. The problem isn't the people, the problem is the organisation. Someone else, and I'm so sorry that I forget who, because the analogy is superb, and I keep looking to see if I can find out, remind myself who it was who said it. I can't, I'm afraid, but someone described this as a situation akin to finding a goldfish bowl full of murky water with goldfish swimming around in it, and taking the fish out, pampering them, polishing them up, cleaning them up, and putting them back into the dirty water of the goldfish bowl, and not actually cleaning the water. The message being, you need to clean the water, not the goldfish. If you're not dealing with the systemic, the cultural, the organisational issues, then you're not really dealing with the basic underlying problem. And while, you know, cleaning the goldfish might have some sort of short-term effect, it's not going to work for long, because you're putting them back into dirty water. So what does influence women's propensity to leave? Well, we already know from previous research that 15 factors really stand out here. These are not comprehensive. There will of course be others that aren't mentioned here. But there are a range of factors at play here, from the support that people get from their line manager, to organisational culture, which we've talked about already, to the team that they work with, the amount of work they do, and overwork is a really impactful factor in this story, to some more personal characteristics like physical and mental health, like childcare, like elder care. And all of these have some sort of a bearing on propensity to leave. It's really important to point out that there are 4 factors here: perimenopause and menopause symptoms, elder care, childcare, physical and mental health, that are distinct from the rest, which is to say these are factors that do not sit within the control of an organisation, at least not to any great extent, where the others clearly do. And so to mix them up with these other factors is definitely problematic, but it's important because it helps us to contextualise those. It helps us to see them in comparison with some of these other factors and to understand what level of priority they should assume. So then we think about, well, how do we talk about those factors? How do we kind of show those factors in terms of how they affect propensity to leave? And what we conclude is that there are 2 things at play here in respect of any of these factors. The first is the impact it has on decisions to stay or go, the weight it carries, if you like, acknowledging that different factors will carry different weights. And the second is how positively or negatively people feel about things, each of these factors. So what we've done is to map those onto a scatter chart, onto a good old-fashioned 2x2 matrix, the vertical axis of which shows the increasing weight attributed to each of these factors. So the higher up the vertical axis a factor is, the bigger an impact it has on propensity to leave. And the horizontal axis showing the extent to which women are either positive or negative about this factor, because we could have a situation in which, for example, one of these factors carries a huge amount of weight. In other words, it is really impactful on decisions about whether to stay or go, but it's actually viewed very positively. So it has a very big impact and a very positive impact. By contrast, we may have a factor that has relatively little bearing on decisions about whether to stay or go, but is nevertheless viewed quite negatively. So the combination of those 2 things is quite important. And we need to keep a particular eye here on the top left-hand box, which is where factors have an above average impact on propensity to leave and are viewed negatively. These are the real high priority items. So let's take those 15 factors based on what women tell us, and let's put them onto our scatter chart. And here's what we see. Actually, we see quite a positive picture, which perhaps reflects the fact that, you know, the average woman says they're 38% likely to leave and not higher than that. Broadly speaking, the more something matters, the more women are to be positive about it. So, for example, the factor that matters most, the factor that has the biggest impact here on decisions about whether to stay or go, support from line managers, is also something about which women speak really, really positively. Similarly, the team that they work with, really big impact on decisions about whether to stay or go, and something in fact that they're even more positive about. Flexibility from a location perspective, another really impactful and generally very positive factor. So generally speaking, this chart is tilted in the right direction. There are already some factors here, things like prospects for career progression, things like amount of work, that sit slightly closer to the negative side of our chart, but they are still on the positive side. Look at some of those personal factors. Now again, let's be cautious here. These are different in nature, and it is problematic in many ways to show them on the same chart. They do all have a negative impact on propensity to leave. So they're going to have some sort of negative bearing, even if that bearing isn't really significant. And it isn't really significant because they sit somewhere down the list compared with some of these other factors, things like support from line managers, the day-to-day work itself, the team I work with. By contrast with those, things like childcare commitments, physical and mental health challenges are things that are less likely to impact decisions about whether to stay or go. Now, of course, another problem with these, not every woman in our sample is experiencing physical or mental health challenges. Not every woman in our survey is experiencing menopause symptoms. But firstly, hopefully that gives you a bit of a sense of where organisational priorities need to lie, which is to say, for example, that when you're thinking about the retention of women in the round, menopause, important though it is, and every factor on this chart is important to some extent, sits somewhere behind, some way behind sorting out the consistency of line management, sits some way behind helping to build teams that really function, sits some way behind the need to find meaningful, challenging work for women to do, and the need to find ways to allow them to work flexibly. In fact, even among women who are experiencing perimenopause or menopause symptoms, menopause is the 11th most impactful factor. For those women, the 11th most impactful factor on decisions about whether to stay or go. It increases in impact, unsurprisingly. It's a bigger thing, but it doesn't have the impact that things like support from line manager has. It doesn't have the impact that things like the day-to-day work itself has. And that context, that difference between these factors is really, really important. Let's look now at women who say that they are at least 75% likely to leave their employer. So these are people who are really kind of on their way out the door, if you like. These are people who are pretty much firmly committed to exiting the organisation. And unsurprisingly, what we see is a change in the balance of that chart. The matrix has now tilted towards the exit. And we've got 4 factors that have moved into that top left-hand box, this kind of high-risk zone: culture, salary and benefits, amount of work, prospects for career progression. These have all now moved into an area that really positions them as high priorities. We've still got a lot over on the positive side, but we've got a situation where these factors are generally leaning more towards the exit than they were before. Note here that actually there hasn't been a huge amount of change in terms of the impact of each of these factors. So things haven't moved up and down very significantly, but they have moved left and right really quite significantly. And some things more than others. So actually what I'm showing here are the factors about which sentiment has deteriorated most significantly. So the bigger the arrow, the more sentiment has deteriorated. So chief amongst which, prospects for career progression, culture. Those factors have shifted more than any others from right to left. Their views about those have really deteriorated between the overall sample and people who are 75% likely to leave. Views about the amount of work people are being asked to do have deteriorated as well. Views about training and development have deteriorated. Even though that's a less impactful factor, it's now sitting very close to sort of negative territory. But look here as well at support from line managers. There's been quite a significant deterioration here, but actually views about this on balance are still positive. And that, I think, tells us something about the importance of good line management, because we've got a situation here where people are, to all intents and purposes, moving towards the exit door and kind of think their line manager is okay. But what this suggests is that that's really not good enough. Their views have deteriorated quite a lot, because compared with the average respondent to our survey, they're quite a bit more negative. It really brings with it the sense that line management needs to be a lot more than okay. With all of these other things going on, the role of line management is absolutely critical and needs to be a really positive thing. So that's how the situation looks when we start to look only at women who are about to leave. What does that all add up to? And this is where we bring in the views of women who have already left their employer. Now, this was a smaller group of women. They were a little harder to get hold of, and there are issues with that part of our sample as well, because these were women who had not yet gone on to work for another employer. That would have just created a little bit of confusion in terms of which employer they told us about. But we did ask those women to look back and tell us about the reasons that they left. And those reasons echoed really precisely the sort of reasons that we were seeing on the previous charts. And in fact, they turned up in this order, which turns into our five priorities. Number one, culture. More than anything else, culture is the thing that women are likely to say was the reason that they left their last employer. And as we've seen on the charts on the previous pages, it's a factor that deteriorates a lot as women move from being happy employees who are likely to stay to being employees who are likely to leave. Culture really, really matters. Prospects for career progression, perhaps unsurprisingly, really matter, have a really significant bearing on a woman's propensity to leave. Line management, as we talked about, really, really matters. The day-to-day work itself, just what it's like to have your head down doing the job that you're paid to do, has a huge bearing on your propensity to leave. And the amount of work really matters, and I've mentioned this briefly in passing before, but amount of work, the correlation between the amount that people are working, and specifically the correlation between overwork and propensity to leave, is one of the clearest bits of data in all of our research. In simple terms, the more people are overworking, the more likely they are to say that they're going to leave. And there don't appear to be huge allowances made for the nature of work that people are doing, for example. So you might, for example, think that people in the legal sector would just expect that they're going to be asked to work incredibly long hours, and that their salary was, you know, some sort of recompense for that inconvenience. Some sort of allowance is made for that, but it's really not significant. In fact, that correlation between overwork and propensity to leave still very clearly exists, even in sectors like the legal sector and professional services. It is really that simple. The more someone is overworking, the more likely they are to say that they'll leave. So these 5 factors really stand out as priorities that need to be addressed. And to underline the point, you can put all of the effort you like, and there is a huge amount of very well-intentioned, very well-designed, very well-structured effort going into supporting women to deal with challenges like menopause, like childcare, like elder care, like physical and mental health challenges. But if you are not addressing culture, if you are not addressing the quality of line management in your organisation, then those efforts will only ever have a limited impact. You've got to clean the water. You've got to clean the water first.